Welcome to Classic Movie Club. Let's go over the rainbow and journey into a world of pure imagination. We'll travel north by northwest, past the house on Haunted Hill, and down into Monument Valley. We'll encounter monsters and gangsters, follow spies, be hit by pies. We'll laugh and we'll cry and we'll fall in love all over again. Along the way, let's have a drink in Rick's Cafe, step in time on the rooftops of London, and stop to sing in the rain. Join us in the Classic Movie Club. It's the stuff that dreams are made of. I'm your host, Chad Knurk, the digital editor of Film Review. We're glad you're here, and in today's episode, I'll be speaking with KJ Relth-Miller, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures Director of Film Programs, about curating film series for the Academy's David Geffen and Ted Mann Theaters, and KJ's film series Forever a Contender, a centennial tribute to Marlon Brando. Classic Movie Club is also an online community sharing a love and passion of classic movies. The podcast will focus on staying evergreen with interviews and coverage of classic movies that you can listen to at any time. Film Review has been celebrating cinema since 1944. Over the years, our contributing authors have included such luminaries as directors Alfred Hitchcock, Michael Powell, and Cecil B. DeMille, just to name a few. The seasoned critics on our staff have been professionally reviewing films since the 70s, including our executive editor James Cameron Wilson, who took over the reins from Film Review founder F. Morris Speed. And the vast majority of our contributing critics are also long-standing members of the prestigious London Film Critics Circle, with the exception of myself, the lone American. In 2015, after 70 annual print volumes of Film Review, the brand went digital with Film Review Daily, and the website offers reviews in daily rather than annual format. Be sure to check us out at filmreviewdaily.com. The desire to share films, whether through a tangible film collection or a collective experience, is a desire that resonates with many a movie lover. It's also a career path. Behind the programming at every local community art house and repertory cinema is a film programmer making those tough decisions of what movies to show and when. Joining us in the club is KJ Relth-Miller, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures Director of Film Programs, to talk about her origins as a film programmer and share insights into her work through the lens of her current program, Forever a Contender, a centennial tribute to Marlon Brando. For those of us who love sharing film, I would love for you to take us back to the beginning of your career and your backyard screening series.
I grew up loving film. I grew up watching film. Both of my parents are very film literate individuals. My dad was really into international film, specifically Japanese film when I was growing up, and also silent classic comedians like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. My mom is a little bit more omnivorous and really like kind of introduced me to a lot of the classics that I know and love today, like a lot of Hollywood classics.
Yeah.
But I really thought I was going to be an actor. And so I really started my career thinking that I was going to be a stage actor. And then I took one class when I was 20 called Film as Literature that kind of opened that up for me. But I didn't really know that I wanted to be a film programmer until I was in my late 20s and kind of recognizing that repertory film programming was a viable career and that, the person who's making the decision of what to show at the New Beverly, what to screen at the American Cinematheque here in LA was something that one could do for a living. And so before I realized that there would be opportunities in the field and around town to do this professionally, I was just working with a friend who lives in Atwater who had a great backyard space and a giant VHS collection. And we were starting in the summer of 2014. We just started doing some fun double feature pairings of like my favorite one was Phantom of the Paradise with the Toxic Avenger,
Right.
and just really having fun with the idea of pairing films that you wouldn't otherwise watch together
Yeah.
in a free, very like relaxed space where you could also like drink and and snack and maybe like step aside to play an arcade game or something, but that it was very much like an open, free and accessible way to interact with cult movie culture, with your friends. And so I started that, and then put that on my resume, and that attracted the attention of the first theater that hired me as a film programmer. And so it really, I think with this job specifically, it's not a profession that you can learn any other way than doing it, right? Like I did not know how to book film titles for theatrical screenings until I started doing it. So there's really no educational training for this kind of work outside of just understanding film history and film movements and studying, you know, different aspects of this very rich medium. But there's really no way to learn how to do the nitty gritty of it until you're really doing it. It was a fun exercise in sort of like audience experimentation, what I was doing with my friend in his backyard in the summer of 2014 and 2015. And really coming to the idea of film programming as not just picking movies, but also understanding what your audience wants to see and anticipating that.
There's a just such a tremendous amount of research and consideration and effort that I would imagine goes into the process of creating a film series. What does that typically look like for you?
Yeah, the process of ideating for a film series can start several ways, especially at the museum. We take inspiration for the programs at the museum through several modes. Of course, we always have the opportunity to dive into our institutional history, and the 96 years of the Oscars.
Yeah.
And we really get to exercise that muscle through our Oscar Sundays program. And there's always opportunities at the museum to speak about our institutional history and trends and certain figures that stand out throughout that institutional history, especially with regard to leadership at the organization and folks who have been reflected and filmmaking movements that have been reflected in the history of the Academy Awards. So that's always going to be part of the film programming that we do. And we're so fortunate that we have access to resources like the Margaret Herrick Library, where that vast wealth of institutional knowledge really exists and is kept alive by the librarians and researchers who work there. But when we're thinking about ways to activate our exhibitions and our galleries, there's always different approaches, right? There you can do, for example, with our John Waters exhibition, The Pope of Trash, a full filmmaker retrospective, right? That's kind of the easiest go-to answer for how to take a John Waters narrative and put it on screen in our cinemas. We're kicking off our series called In the Midnight Hour, the history of late night movies. If you have studied Jay Hoberman and Jonathan Rosenbaum's book, Midnight Movies, they make the argument that Pink Flamingos is one of the six first ever midnight movies, with El Topo being kind of the initial midnight movie. And so, in thinking of other ways to draw attention to the John Waters exhibit, my team and I thought it would be really a fun experiment to activate the history of midnight movies through a repertory series. And so this weekend we have John Waters joining us to introduce Pink Flamingos, which is really exciting. And it's also not a one-to-one way of thinking about the galleries, right? So there's fun ways to take our Godfather exhibition, for example, and focus on a single figure who was working behind the scenes on The Godfather, Dick
Mhm.
Smith in this case, the makeup artist, where we did a full, a pretty robust Dick Smith retrospective to again honor the Godfather exhibition and point back to that. And Brando is also, of course, Marlon Brando is also a figure represented in the Godfather exhibition. And so it's been really fun to tease out his entire filmography and think about what would be the most interesting ways to showcase his trajectory as an actor and as a performer. And of course, The Godfather is one of those texts. And so we're pointing back to the galleries again, but this is also Brando's centennial year. Yesterday would have been his 100th birthday.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're really lucky to also have our curators, our wonderful exhibition curators, leading the way when it comes to that kind of initial deep dive research because our curators are working on such a longer lead time than our film programs are. But when it comes to determining which films in a series, and we can use the Brando series as an example, it starts with, for me, watching and reading. And so going back and rewatching some of his films that I haven't seen in a while, or making new discoveries. A couple of films that I watched that did not make it into the series, but were really revelatory for thinking about him again and his trajectory as a performer and the different phases of his performance career. And so it really starts with watching and then a lot of reading. There are so many biographies on Brando.
Yeah.
Even though he really rejected the idea of biographies and like he really rejected the idea of celebrity. He had a real disdain for celebrity actually, and he really had a lifelong resistance to biographers. But so it's interesting to see just how many the wide breadth of books that are available that are either during his lifetime or posthumously considering who Brando was on screen and off screen, right? So a lot of reading went into it, and also just a lot of consideration about what we've screened recently and what we think will play well with our audiences, which is not so much research, but really comes from a knowledge of our own institutional history as a museum, right? We've been open about 2.5 years at this point, and but we already have over 1,000 screenings that we've done here at the museum. And so to think about, even though we have screened The Godfather several times, we decided to screen it again because it's such a seminal text for his career and such a big moment for him as sort of a comeback performance, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when we're thinking about ways to approach a series, there are several different starting points, but ultimately, it really, for me at least, is about watching and reading and talking, right? And really having thoughtful discussions with my team and asking them because each of us comes from different backgrounds, experiences, and film history knowledge. And so to ask them whether they think it would be interesting to watch his performance in Burn versus The Chase, and which might offer a different side of Brando the performer for an audience that we hope is coming to as many of these screenings as possible.
Yeah, and I like looking at some of his other work and the idea of a series coming back and seeing a greater picture, right, than just one particular film. So I'd love to just walk through some of the films and hear some of your thoughts behind them.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize there are kind of two parts to this series. So there's our Oscar Sundays Brando, four titles that do include his Oscar nominated or winning performances. And then there's a limited series, Forever a Contender, that is focusing on the not necessarily the films that received Oscar recognition for his performances.
Yeah, so
So
you've got like multiple levels there where you
yeah,
do each individual film, each individual series, or see a big breadth of his work altogether.
yes, absolutely. So we initially wanted in our initial talks with the Brando Archive, and they have been incredible collaborative partners on this program in opening up their vaults and letting us have access to some incredible primary source material, letters that Brando sent and received to various figures, celebrities, politicians, people of cultural import. They have audio recordings. He used to record on, I believe, a Dictabelt, his rehearsals so that he
Oh,
could
wow.
listen back to them. Because even though he was throughout his life, an incredible mimic. He could spend 5 minutes with you and be able to emulate your walk immediately after those first 5 minutes of knowing you. He
Hmm.
was really keen on studying people's speech patterns and trying to replicate them. And so he perfected, through the use of this recording technology, his practice of his accents. So they have some of those recordings, and to be able to listen to those was also just, a fascinating way to see this different side of this, almost godlike figure for so many people. To have that access and that intimate access to him was so great. So major thank you to the Brando Archive for opening their doors to us as we were doing the initial research for this series. And we knew that part of the story of Brando was always going to be the story of the Oscars, right? Famously and infamously in one specific case. And so we wanted to pay tribute to some of his more interesting performances in different modes, though, of course, recognizing his close collaboration with Elia Kazan and their important, work back at the Actors Studio when they were both studying with Stella Adler. It was really important to showcase some of these better known titles like The Godfather, On the Waterfront, Julius Caesar, and Streetcar Named Desire, in order to look at sort of the dominant narrative of Brando, which is the narrative that most of us are familiar with. But then in thinking about some of the titles that maybe don't screen as much or that show a different side of his personality and his incredible talent. I did want to dig deep, and there are some that I just didn't have space for because we don't have space for everything, unfortunately. I would have loved to screen The Chase. I would have loved to screen The Freshman. I would have loved to screen Apocalypse Now. But I think that instead, by pulling out films like the rarely screened Burn, which we found an amazing print of, and we're so thrilled that we were able to find a version that is not dubbed, where Brando is actually speaking for himself, because there are both versions out in the world. So it was very important to us to do that research and actually locate a print where we hear Brando's voice in that role, because there is a dubbed Italian version of that film that I think audiences would have been very disappointed to see. Also to focus on his directorial effort, his sole directorial effort in One-Eyed Jacks, which is one of, at this point, my favorite Westerns of all time. I think it's so idiosyncratic, and part of that comes from the nature of its production, with Stanley Kubrick stepping off the project and Brando stepping in to take over for him. And then also the fact that it's a California Western. I mean, it's not very often that you see horses riding along a beachfront in a Western, and to see horses riding along a beachfront as being ridden by Marlon Brando is truly a one of a kind image. And it also, as with so many of the projects that he worked on, especially in the 1960s and moving into the rest of his career, social justice was such an important aspect of his life that comes from his family, and a sort of genetic history of being predisposed to gravitate toward and speak about social justice causes and issues, that some of those more complicated portrayals of marginalized figures come through in One-Eyed Jacks in a really nuanced way that we weren't seeing, that we quite frankly rarely see in Westerns.
Mm.
So it was important to allow some of the off-screen aspects of Brando to also seep into the films that we were picking. And that includes something like Guys and Dolls, right? There was a moment when he started at the New School and was studying under Stella Adler that he was also taking classes in the dance department and taking choreography classes. And he thought for a minute that he wanted to be a modern dancer. So that he's engaging with a classic, a later era classic Hollywood musical, like Guys and Dolls, is also kind of a dip into that career that could have been for him. Even
Yeah.
though he never quite fancied himself a singer, it is a really interesting thing to think about him engaging with a production mode that usually does have, like, exuberant song and dance in his own way. And I also just really, like, from a child, have loved that movie. So it was important to include it.
One-Eyed Jacks being in 4K, and then you have some 35 millimeter, and the Academy is really good about doing a broad scope of formats. And so I wanted to ask about that as well.
Whenever we can, we really prefer to screen a film on the format on which it was shot, right?
Mm.
So in the case of many of the films in this retrospective, actually all of them, they were originally shot on film. But there have been some instances, like with One-Eyed Jacks, where it's been rescued from relative obscurity and been restored. And so, of course, we want to show the best available copy of that film. But yeah, I mean, you got it right. You kind of nailed it. We really are looking to find the best quality material for each film, and in some cases, that's a 35 millimeter print. In other cases, it's a newer or a more recent 4K restoration.
the social justice aspect of Brando and that being important. What are some of the conversations happening around these series?
We are screening A Streetcar Named Desire, preceded by a conversation with Rebecca and Miko Brando, two of Marlon's children. We've also invited actors Carrie Elwes, who worked with him as his personal assistant for like 3 days on Superman. His stepfather, Carrie Elwes' stepfather, made 3 pictures with Brando, including Missouri Breaks. So Carrie has this really incredible, just incredible stories about their relationship, their times together on set, and then their times as spent later as friends. And we also have actor Ed Begley Jr., who is, a noted and very vocal environmentalist. And he and Brando would have long discussions about ways to make the island that Marlon Brando later bought after shooting Mutiny on the Bounty.
Oh,
He
yeah,
purchased the island that was
right.
partially used to shoot that film, and has been, really at the front of considering sustainable ways of living
Mm,
in island territory. And so Ed Begley Jr. will be sharing some of the ways that he and Marlon were discussing ways to make clean and green power. He was really Brando was a voracious reader and really interested in understanding how to turn algae into a fuel source, and thinking about deep ocean water cooling and all sorts of, methods that, for his time were pretty ahead of time. We haven't really been thinking about clean energy in this country for more than 20 years in a really substantial way. And Marlon has been gone for 20 years. So I think he was really in the same way that he was at the forefront of civil rights issues and always thinking about the worker and maybe the people behind the scenes. He was also incredibly invested in spending time with the grips and like the artists who were working to support the major positions on a film set. That's who he was eating lunch with on breaks, was the grips, the dolly grips, the third ADs. Like he was down there spending time with them, not to soak up praise from them, but just to like have fun and have real conversations with real people. So I think that when we're joined on stage as well on Sunday night by David Page, who was one of Brando's costumers for the last 3 films that they worked on together, including Don Juan DeMarco, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The Score. I know that David will have a lot to share about, the ways that they interacted, the late night conversations they would have when Marlon would call him at 3 a.m. to discuss whatever was on his mind because he was having a bout of insomnia. But I think David has a lot of stories to share also about, the way that he interacted with folks like him on set, the hair and makeup artists, the folks who you wouldn't think a star of Brando's caliber would maybe gravitate to.
mm.
So I think a lot of those will come up in conversation. And also his biographer, Susan Misraki, really thinks that some of his ideas were quite prophetic, and we're almost anticipating, not just the social justice issues that would still be on our minds today. I think if Brando were alive, I don't want to speak for him, but I would love to hear, what Marlon would have to say about Black Lives Matter, about Me Too. I think he would have a lot of ideas that would really surprise us. And I also think that his critique of celebrity and his awareness of what it meant to be a celebrity was extremely evolved. And I think would also, I wonder, for example, what Marlon would have to say about influencers, because I'm sure he would have an opinion.
Growing up, were there classic films that made an impact on you?
The Wizard of Oz was a big one for me. We must have had it recorded off TV on VHS, and there's actually a home movie of me sitting and sort of playing with dolls in my room and quoting lines from it when I was 2. So that film has always, I didn't realize how much it meant to me until I saw that home movie and was like, oh wow, this has always been part of me. This is that's pretty deep. But yeah, The Wizard of Oz is a major one for me. I also when I was in my
tween age years, definitely gravitated more toward thrillers and not what I would call necessarily horror movies, but I got really into Hitchcock when I was
Mm.
12 and 13 and would like was the weird kid who was bringing Psycho on VHS to a sleepover, you know. Um, so those are two major ones really, like big MGM musicals, like The Wizard of Oz, and there's others, of course. Singing in the Rain was a huge movie for me as well, and still is. And we're screening that in a couple of weeks. And it's going to be a film that we screen at least once a year until the end of time, because it is not just one of the great Hollywood musicals, it is also starring one of the greatest performers to ever do it, Gene Kelly, and it is one of the best films about filmmaking, I
Yeah,
think, ever
exactly.
made. So,
Yeah.
Singing in the Rain was also a big deal. But yeah, the big MGM musicals, and then started really getting into Hitchcock's career, especially his earlier black and white films and some of the more, Strangers on a Train and a lot of those thrillers.
The Wizard of Oz, Singing in the Rain, Hitchcock, it doesn't get much better than that. A big thank you to KJ Relth-Miller for joining us and to the Academy Museum for all the great work they do, screening classics the way they were always intended on the big screen, and for keeping film history an active conversation. They're always screening something interesting, and the Academy Museum programs a wealth of limited series and spotlights, as well as ongoing series like Oscar Sundays, branch selects, and family matinees, as well as accessible screenings for neurodivergent viewers. And if you haven't been to the Academy Museum, it's a necessary pilgrimage and an absolute mecca for movie lovers. Go and experience all of their fabulous exhibits. And if you're listening to this in 2024, you're in for a treat because the museum's exhibit, The Art of Movie Making, The Godfather, features an array of original objects from The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, offering a glimpse into the process of making the masterpiece. From costumes to props to scripts to that infamous desk, the exhibit highlights the contributions of many and how their innovations helped set the scene for the future of cinema during an evolving landscape in Hollywood. Thank you to KJ Relth-Miller. If you enjoy what we do, please consider becoming a patron and full-fledged member of Classic Movie Club. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey, and we invite you back next month for another adventure. Until then, here's looking at you, kid.